Good evening. Good evening and welcome. Thank you. And also with you. And welcome to University Avenue Church of Christ, to whose leadership we're grateful for hosting tonight's event. My name is Jeff Peterson. I'm a member of this church and a faculty member at Austin Graduate School of Theology. And on behalf of both, I'm happy to welcome you here to the 5th annual Austin Graduate School of Theology First Things Lecture, an event we look forward to every year. In case of anyone unfamiliar, Austin Graduate School of Theology is a seminary associated with Churches of Christ and in conversation with all who confess Jesus as Lord, and indeed with all who are interested in learning more about Jesus and Christian faith in Him. The school's particular mission is to promote knowledge, understanding, and practice of the Christian faith as taught in the Scriptures. It's my impression that more people are aware of First Things, but for anyone not, First Things is the flagship journal of the Institute on Religion and Public Life, founded in 1989 by Richard John Newhouse and others, to confront the ideology of secularism, which insists that the democratic public square must be kept free of claims reflecting religious conviction, and that faith has no proper role in shaping American public conversation or public policy. First Things has been called the leading intellectual journal of religion and public life in the United States and continues now under the editorship of R.R. Reno. If you're unfamiliar with the work of either Austin Graduate School of Theology or First Things, we hope tonight will provide an occasion to become acquainted with both, as well as to reflect on matters in our public life of concern to people of faith. The most important preliminary that we have to note is that if you're parked across the street in the AT&T Center garage, validation for your parking is available and will be located, the validation station will be located in the west foyer through these doors after the lecture. It will be available. Again, we're very glad that you've joined us for this evening's lecture. In just a moment, I'll ask that you join me in prayer that the Spirit of God would be present with us tonight. Following our prayer, the organizer of tonight's event and fellow member of the Austin grad faculty, Keith Stanglin, will come to the lectern and introduce our speaker. Shall we pray? Our Father, giver of every good and perfect gift, we thank you for all that you give us as our Creator and as our Redeemer through your Son, our Lord Jesus Christ. We thank you tonight for the gift of living as citizens or as residents of this state and this country. And we thank you for the immeasurably more valuable gift of living as subjects of your kingdom by your grace. We ask that your Spirit would be present tonight with the one who speaks and with us who listen, that we might more clearly discern how to use the gift of participation in the life of this nation so as to be your more faithful and obedient subjects, rendering to Caesar that which is Caesar's, and only ever to you that which is yours, as Christ our Lord has taught us. We ask that in all our conversation and all our actions in this regard, your Spirit would guide us to discern and speak the truth in love, that the result might not be confusion and bitterness and hatred, but only wisdom and love and peace. We ask the same for all your church, ministering in all the nations of the world, through Jesus Christ our Lord, and the people of God say, amen. Professor Stanglin.
I want to join Jeff Peterson in welcoming all of you here tonight. It's really good to see you. Thankful for your presence. It's good to be a part of this event, now the 5th year in a row in cooperation with First Things. And there's much that recommends this partnership between Austin Graduate School of Theology and First Things. Just to expand a little bit on what Dr. Peterson was saying, As a faculty, we at Austin Grad have sometimes described ourselves as critically orthodox, which is to say thoughtful orthodoxy is what we're after. Well, so is First Things. We also are a part of a Christian movement whose original goal was restoring the unity of the church. I think that is a concern as well, an ecumenical concern of First Things. And additionally, all of us would like to live in a society that is friendly to Christian thought in the public square, or short of that, to be equipped with tools to articulate and live out our Christian faith in a place that is increasingly publicly hostile. So, for all of these reasons, I think there is an affinity from us, an affinity for First Things and for what it produces in print and online. And so one purpose of our gathering tonight is simply informative and introductory. As he said, those readers of First Things who don't know about our school here in Austin, now you do. Our Austin Grad friends, if you don't know about First Things, we recommend this journal. But the more obvious purpose of our assembling together this evening, of course, is the privilege to hear from our esteemed speaker, whom I will now introduce. Mary Eberstadt is a senior research fellow at the Faith and Reason Institute in Washington, D.C., and author of the new book, Primal Screams: How the Sexual Revolution Created Identity Politics. Her other books include It's Dangerous to Believe, How the West Really Lost God, and Adam and Eve After the Pill. Mrs. Eberstadt's writing has appeared in many magazines and journals, including Time, The Wall Street Journal, National Review, The Weekly Standard, and of course, First Things. Her 2010 novel, The Loser Letters, about a young woman in rehab struggling with atheism, was adapted for the stage and premiered at Catholic University in the fall of 2017. Seton Hall University awarded her an honorary doctorate in 2014. During the Reagan administration, she was speechwriter to Secretary of State George Shultz and a special assistant to Ambassador Jeane Kirkpatrick at the United Nations. We're very grateful to have Mary Eberstadt with us tonight, and we look forward to her lecture now on Searching for Self, the Non-Political Roots of Identity Politics. Let's welcome Mrs. Eberstadt.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Peterson, Dr. Stenglin, and thanks also to Rusty Reno and others at First Things, and to the Austin Graduate School of Theology for our time together this week. It's a great pleasure to connect in person and to put our heads together tonight about what seems to be one of the burning preoccupations of our time: the question of identity, the subject of my speech this evening. Now, of course, questions of political identity have been with us eternally. I was reminded of this the other day as I was touring the fascinating Bullock Museum of Texas State History. As most of you, I'm sure, know, its first-floor gallery features an impressive exhibition spanning millennia called Becoming Texas. As the evocative title implies, political identities morph and evolve. The identity of Texans, for instance, might now seem settled, including to those of us who are Texas admirers from outside your state. But many thousands of years, of course, went into that act of settling. The exhibition speaks to the truth that fluctuation in political identity is an enduring fact of life. But the question of political identity in our own time is a different and altogether more complicated beast. I'm here tonight in the hopes that some of my recent work will shed light on what's unique about it. If we step back from the news cycle and immediate questions of politics, which is hard for me to say because I live in Washington, D.C., but if we step back and ask ourselves what is truly singular about our age, I believe that an unexpected answer emerges. The question, "Who am I?" has become one of the most pressing of our time for many people. It's become like a second skin, something that can't be sloughed off or even scratched without excruciating pain to the subject. So one result is the proliferation of political identity groups with which we are familiar, groups based on victim status rather than common humanity, based on gender, ethnicity, feminism, climate activism, and so on. Now, these identity groups share several features in common. One is a profound sense of grievance or loss. Another is the insistence that any given group cannot be understood by people outside that group, that victim status is the new divining rod for truth, not reason or knowledge or religious belief, say. And finally, all of these groups are united by something else, which is primordial loyalty to one's group. There have been many examples in recent memory in which members of particular identity groups have fallen from grace and been spurned by their own collective identity community in what has become a ritual act of purging, and we see this over and over. Think Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, for example, for appearing in blackface. Or think of tennis great Martina Navratilova, who has faced intense criticism for saying that biological males should not be allowed to compete on female sports teams. These and many other people who were once safely within these groups have been shunned. My point is that, as these examples go to show, this is another feature of identity politics, that people within them defend these groups with a fervor that is clannish and familial. This is not politics as usual. So, all of this by introduction to my thesis in Primal Screams about the non-political origin of identity politics. My thesis is that these groups act as figurative families and communities in an era when many actual families and communities are in disarray and decline. Who am I is a universal human question. It becomes harder to answer if other basic questions are problematic, like, who is my brother? Where is my father? Where, if anywhere, are my cousins, grandparents, nieces, and nephews, and the rest of the organic connections through which humanity up until now channeled everyday existence? Post-sexual revolution, every one of these assumptions that our forebears could take for granted is now negotiable for many people. So the panic over identity, in short, is being driven by the fact that human beings are created for familial forms of socialization that for many people no longer exist. In our time tonight, I would like to offer several forms of evidence for this theory so that we might better understand how that elemental question, who am I, has come to drive politics in our time. The answer, I believe, has to do with radical changes to our social order. I would like to zero in on three such changes: changes to the family, changes to the nature of community, and changes to the churches. First, and in most detail, the radical changes to the family following the 1960s. Up until the middle of the 20th century, barring the frequent foreshortening of life by disease or natural catastrophe, human expectations look to have been largely the same throughout the ages. That one would grow up to have children and a family if one were fortunate, that parents and siblings and extended family would remain one's primal community, and that conversely, it was a tragedy through most of human history not to be part of a family. The post-1960s order of sexual consumerism has revolutionized every one of those expectations. It has erased the givenness into which generations are now born. Just how attenuated and weakened have family ties become? Let us count up a few of the ways by reference to sociology. When sociologists first began mapping the post-revolutionary empirical world, they looked first, naturally enough, to the terrain that was easiest to see and measure. Fatherlessness and the correlates of fatherlessness was the most visible thing on the scene. In his famous and some would say infamous report, published in 1965, The Negro Family, The Case for National Action, former Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan argued that black poverty was tied fundamentally to the implosion of the black family. That report worried about the rate of out-of-wedlock births, which was then about 25%. But that rate would continue to rise for both whites and blacks during the decades to come. And again, sociologists tried to trace the connection between those rates of fatherless homes and certain outcomes, education, behavior, etc. In 1997, one of the most eminent social scientists of the 20th century, James Q. Wilson, summarized some of those findings in a famous speech that was later published as an essay. Wilson identified the root of America's fracturing in the dissolution of the family across races. He described what he called the two nations of America. The dividing line between these nations, said Wilson, was no longer one of income or social class. That is a radical statement he backed up with considerable evidence. It is not money, Wilson documented, but the family that is the foundation of national life. As it has become weaker, every structure built on that foundation has become weaker. He summarized deftly the library that social science had been building for decades, filled with books and studies about the various correlations concerning fatherless homes. The point is that his speech was a landmark because it demonstrated that family structure had become more important to positive outcomes than race, income, or one's station at birth. There's a lot in that social science vein, and at the same time, fatherlessness was only the most visible of the things to measure. In a landmark book published in 2000 that is not as well known as James Q. Wilson's work, and should be, Elizabeth Marquardt, working with a sociologist named Norval Glenn, conducted the first study into the long-term effects of parental breakup into adulthood. The book was called Between Two Worlds: The Inner Lives of Children of Divorce. They administered a lengthy questionnaire to some 1,500 young adults, half of whose parents had split up by the time the kids were 14, and they documented the differences between the children of divorce and those who came from intact homes. One finding that I think stands out particularly in retrospect is this. At times, these two groups in the study exhibit starkly opposed concepts of identity. For example, the children of divorce were almost 3 times as likely to strongly agree with this statement. I felt like a different person with each of my parents. They were twice as likely to agree with this statement. I always felt like an adult, even when I was a little kid, which is a clear expression of some kind of identity confusion. And almost 2/3 of the respondents also agreed with the following statement: I felt like I had two families. Again, identity fracture. So this is evocative evidence from social science, again, of a deeply changed sense of self that many people, adult and child alike, now experience as the givens of life. It expresses the division of one self into more than one, selves torn between two worlds, as the book's title had it. And although these researchers limited their study to children of divorce only, of course the findings would appear to apply elsewhere, to any home where two parents are playing a role in a child's life from different locations. So there's plenty more social science in these matters, but that isn't the only way of affirming that changes in the family have been raising fundamental questions of identity for quite a while now. And here I would like to go to some evidence from popular culture. In a 2004 essay called Eminem is Right, which is about 6,000 words long, published in Policy Review, I documented something that seemed and still seems like a seminal fact. Family rupture, family anarchy, and breakup had all become signature themes of Generation X and Generation Y popular music. And obviously I'm not speaking here of Christian music, but of best-selling secular pop music. And I would like to summarize a little of this from the piece. If yesterday's rock was the music of abandon, today's is that of abandonment. The odd truth about contemporary teenage music is its compulsive insistence on the damage wrought by family dysfunction. Papa Roach, Everclear, Blink-182, Good Charlotte, Eddie Vedder and Pearl Jam, Kurt Cobain and Nirvana, Tupac Shakur, Snoop Doggy Dogg, Eminem, all of these best-selling singers and bands, all of which were like award-winning top 40 performers, had their own generational answer to what ails the modern teenager. And in every case, that answer was dysfunctional childhood. This brings us to a great irony, because during these same years, of course, progressive-minded sociologists and politicians and others were excoriating the traditional home by mocking, for example, Ozzie and Harriet. And I see in this audience that a lot of people don't know who Ozzie and Harriet were. This was a television show that was on TV before I was born, so I share your pain. But basically, Ozzie and Harriet are the most maligned television couple in history, because apparently they had a happy traditional home with two children whom they loved. And so they became, this figurative whipping boy about the traditional family. But during the same years in which all of that was being mocked and sidelined, popular music was delivering its own answer to what was wrong out there. And that was rage about what not having had an intact family had done to them. I find that a great irony and a proof unto itself of the connection between the loss of identity and the loss of the family. So this was 15 years ago, and identity politics was not the omnipresent headline that it is today. But the effect of family decline was being writ large out there. Tupac Shakur, a rapper, repeatedly referred to life with his mom and no male parent, and he wrote one of the single saddest songs I have ever heard, Papa's Song, which is dominated by the image of a boy who has to learn to play catch by himself. Again, These were not subliminal themes in this music. Pearl Jam, Kurt Cobain, all of these groups gave interviews constantly about the effect of family dysfunction on their art. And above all, this is true for the fiery emotional connection that generations of teenagers have found in Eminem. His signature themes are, again, absent father, inattentive mother, protectiveness toward a sibling, and rage. Eminem is the Greek chorus of family dysfunction. So, again, long ago, before today's identity politics had become national political issues, a lot of young America was already stumbling over how to answer the question, who am I? And you could tell just by listening to what they were listening to on the radio. So, here is a fourth round of evidence about the connections between today's identity politics and the scattering of the family. And this set of evidence comes from assisted reproduction technology, particularly anonymous sperm donation. The creation of human beings in this way, that is purposely deprived of knowing at least one genetic parent, is an experiment so novel that it has yet to receive widespread scholarly attention. No one knows how many children have come into existence through these techniques, which are largely unregulated in the United States and elsewhere. But one major analysis, I think the first, of these techniques' effect on identity is highly suggestive. This is a 2010 study called My Daddy's Name is Donor, a new study of young adults conceived through sperm donation. This assembles the first representative sample of 485 adults between 18 and 45 whose mother used an anonymous sperm donor, and it compares those results with a set of people the same ages who had been raised by biological parents. So they found certain deficits in the anonymously conceived population, reporting that they were hurting more or were more confused and felt more isolated from their families, and also showed a higher likelihood of depression and delinquency. But though those outcomes are suggestive, I don't think they're even the most interesting for my purposes. Most interesting is that there were clear signs of identity confusion in that subgroup. For example, about 2/3 of the sample agreed with the statement, "My sperm donor is half of who I am." But if half of who you are is something you can't find, what does that do to your identity? The survey also yielded another finding with clear implications for identity confusion, which is more than half of the population said that when they see someone else who resembles them, they wonder if they're related. So these kind of details, I think, show us once more that we construct identity by looking first to those immediately around us. And we see this in the popularity of technologies like 23andMe, for instance. Again, we construct identity by looking for relatedness. Now, the children of sperm donation are, of course, tiny in numbers relative to the population, but this mapping of their emotional state renders a truth that applies across the spectrum. Human beings try to answer the question, who am I, by knowing who our relations are, even when we've been deprived of that information on purpose. No wonder in an age when it's harder to know who our relations are, so many people seem confused about identity. Now, fifth, and finally in this roundup of radical changes to the family, I would like to note one other contender that is not written about as much, and perhaps should be, and that's the numerical shrinkage of most Western families, whether they are split or intact. One consequence is the diminishing number of people who grow up with siblings and extended family in the form of cousins, etc. So as a result of changing pressures and preferences, it's now much more common for American mothers, say, to have 1 or 2 children, rather than 3 or more, as was the case in the early 1960s. Single children have become the norm across much of Europe and Asia by now, and their numbers are also increasing in the US. As the Pew Research Center recently noted, there is even talk of middle children going extinct. So what this means is many contemporary children not only lack a parent, typically a male parent, but many also have no siblings or no sibling of the same or opposite sex. So why might this matter? Well, it matters in part because diverse findings show that being accompanied through life by non-parental contemporaneous others, sociology for siblings, gives children and teenagers a leg up on socialization. In other words, it provides them with an answer to who am I within the immediate social order of the family. So a Canadian study from 2018, for instance, suggests that siblings learn empathy from one another, independent of birth order. Another study has found that the likelihood of divorce later in life can be predicted by the number of siblings one has. The higher the number, the lower the likelihood of divorce. So when sociologists try to figure out what that means, of course, they conjecture that the necessity of sharing resources from early on in life prepares siblings for essential social skills, like bargaining and taking turns. One more study that made headlines last year showed that growing up with an opposite-sex sibling was particularly beneficial because it made teenagers and young adults more confident and successful in the romance market. Now, of course, these findings don't apply always and everywhere to every individual, but they are evocative of groups. Here, too, we have another radical change to family structure that is affecting many people system-wide, and that introduces uncertainty into that question, who am I? So let's go to part 2 of the discussion, and this is a shortened version of the changes in community, because I think some of this research is familiar to people. But just as social science has delivered important signposts here and there about the radical weakening of families, so have experts also documented the weakening of many communal ties. In his landmark 2000 book, Bowling Alone, political scientist Robert Putnam mapped the dislocations of declining communities and associations. His is an important empirical guide to seeing just how radically life changed for many people after the 1960s. And here again, we see a distinct chipping away at the building blocks of identity. Who am I could be answered in part by reference to one's bowling league, or one's baseball team, or one's role as a scout leader, or other forms of civic engagement. And of course, to some extent, the question can still be answered with reference to those kind of associations. But as Putnam suggested 20 years ago, to a much lesser extent than before. And Putnam's kind of findings have echoed through other assessments over the years. Some years ago, sociologist Alan Ehrenholt traced the effects of the changing family on the environment around the home. So, driven in part by the rise in single-parent homes and two-parent working homes, alongside the shrinking of the family, children of the 1980s and beyond became much less likely to enjoy free outdoor time, especially after school, than kids were before. And I think we're all familiar with this phenomenon, especially those of us who can remember just being turned out of the house and told to go play until dark. But this is in part a collapse of critical mass. It's the collapse of a tribe of kids to which one can attach. It was also because there were fewer eyes on the street, as Ehrenholt put it, fewer siblings, less extended family, and fewer of adults of any kind who were home during those hours after school. So the result is familiar to all of us. Screen time is up, outdoor playtime is down, and many adolescents and children, despite all of their hours in school, are radically detached from friends and peers, and a whole new crop of loneliness studies on teenagers and 20-somethings bears this out. So these same changes also, I would argue, have had a less visible but very real negative effect on identity. School is one way of answering the question, who am I? I'm the best student in the school, I'm the worst student in the school. But not every child excels in school. And at one time, those who didn't could derive recognition via associations outside of school, say the captain of the softball team, or as an Eagle Scout, or as a member of the local fire department youth marching band, etc. But when the free time of the young is as constricted as it is today due to widespread familial change, these associations, these juvenile associations, have declined as well. And so once more, some partial but real answers to the question, who am I, have been taken off the table, especially for the young. The third set of changes I would like to look at is also consequential in ways that I believe we're only beginning to understand. Until very recently in human history, there was another traditional way of answering that universal question, who am I? And that was by reference to religious faith. That was by reference to another kind of familial relationship, a supernatural filial relationship. If you ask Christians, who am I? They will say, I am a child of God, right? That's the most important thing about me. It's not my skin color, it's not my sex, it's not my erotic proclivities, it's that I am a child of God. And also, as a child of God, of course, I'm situated, excuse me, in an immediate community of figurative brothers and sisters around the world. Christianity and other religions hand people an instant family, an instant identity. But we live in an age of rising religious illiteracy. And that means that this is one more answer to that question of identity that is beyond the reach of many people. And I don't use that phrase, religious illiteracy, to be rude. I mean that going to church is not just a matter of getting out of bed on a Sunday morning. Church is shorthand for many things, like absorbing the Christian tradition bit by bit. The words of the Bible, the teachings of church fathers and others, the whole magnificent intellectual and artistic tradition that Christianity has handed down. And as more than a few writers have pointed out, aspects of that tradition are also incorporated into our very founding as a country, into our government and into our laws. This means that as young Americans stray further from organized religion, they are also rendered less capable of understanding their government and their laws and their country. So it's no wonder that patriotism is also in decline among the young. Deprived of knowing Christianity, they are also deprived in part of knowing who they are as citizens. Secularization has robbed the young of other possible answers to that question, who am I? So those are the broad outlines of the argument in Primal Screams. In closing, I would like to meditate a little on what this analysis means for the United States today. Primal Screams argues that post-1960s social phenomena have amounted to a massive disturbance of the human ecosystem, that these effects are increasingly visible as well as harmful, and that they are now playing out in politics where many dislocated individuals are frantically trying to answer the question, who am I, politically, because they cannot answer it any other way. I believe this dynamic is behind some of the most familiar and troubling phenomena we see today. As mentioned, at the national level, there is the divisiveness of identity politics, but there are also other signs of disunity and pathology that go to the question of identity. Mass shootings, rising psychiatric trouble, especially among the young, white nationalism and its resurgence, unprecedented drug addiction as seen in the opioid crisis. Now, some of these phenomena have more roots than one, of course, including economic roots and roots in social media. But they are also set into motion by people who cannot answer that question, who am I, in ways that it used to be answerable. Now, I would like to stress here that the net effects of community and family breakdown are not affecting everybody equally, obviously. There isn't some magic one-to-one correspondence that said if you didn't have X, you will be Y, etc. It's about the collective environment that we share. And the analogy I would use is that it's like a factory dumping toxins into a lake. Over time, some of the fish are affected and some of the fish are not, and scientists can't figure out why in the case of individuals. But again, it's a collective environment that is increasingly toxic. Further evidence for this thesis about the relationship between the family and identity politics appeared in a poll commissioned in 2018 by The Atlantic magazine and the Public Religion Research Institute. It showed a strong link between political engagement and youth. And a reporter for The Atlantic summarized the numbers in this way that I found to vindicate my thesis. He said, religiously unaffiliated voters who may or may not be associated with other civic institutions seem most excited about supporting or donating to causes, going to rallies, expressing opinions online, etc. And then there was this sentence: political engagement may be providing these Americans with a new form of identity. So this is exactly my point in Primal Screams. And just as political and other new identities have become substitutes for the more robust identities of family and community, so are these identities defended with a passion that most people once brought to defending families and communities. My point is that politics is being increasingly driven by primordial needs and desires that have been detoured into politics. And now for the question we would all like answered: what is to be done? The world is always fallen, but it has not always been marked by the delusions and the particular kind of suffering that we see today. The level of familial chaos in particular is really quite new in human history, apart from times of war or other catastrophe. So what are we to do about any of it? Well, unexpected though it may seem, I think that there are solid grounds for hope. And in closing, I will offer 3 possible avenues. First, it is not true that those who are concerned with these matters are alone. Quite the contrary. It is often easy to feel isolated and encircled and embattled, especially the more time we spend online. But recent years have also seen an outpouring of new and newly urgent scholarship by writers both established and emerging who are concerned with these deep, radical things. There's also been a rapid increase in many other new communities that I could name, Protestant and Catholic alike. Some of them are on campuses, and all have arisen as a response to the social chaos that reigned on many of these campuses when many of us were there years ago. These are just a few of the newly minted organic forms of fellowship that will transform the American landscape in ways unimaginable to us today. All of them are founded on the hunger for an authentic account of the human person and the human condition, a search for transcendence in a world where many people insist there is none. My point is that the radical culture out there is itself sowing the seeds of revival and reaction. Second, never underestimate the power of example, including the power of your example at the Austin Graduate School of Theology and elsewhere in the communities that people in this room come from. Here I'd like to share a story that often comes to mind when I think, we really are seeing signs of an emerging counterculture out there. Once I gave a talk at a secular university, and a young woman came up to talk afterwards. She was a Christian convert. She hailed from a totally secular background. And so I asked her what had brought her into the church. Was it books, art, sacred music, philosophy? And as it turned out, all of my guesses were wrong. She said it was because of a friend whose house she used to visit as a teenager. This friend hailed from a big Christian family, which was very foreign to this young woman and very, very fascinating. In the end, she said, I was just unable to keep myself away. She said, I wanted what they had. So today, given the trends that I described earlier on, there are many more people than ever who want what you have in your communities, beginning with the community of the family. And you will never know when any of them are looking at you wistfully or crossing a church doorstep for the first time, all because they want what you have. And this, too, is a reason for hope. Third, I think we need to remember ourselves and our texts and our history as Christians, and to have some confidence in those things. The tough but beautiful consistency of the Christian moral code has drawn in converts ever since it was mocked by the pagans of Rome and by pagans in every era to follow. That code has made St. Augustines out of sinners in every age. It embodies a story about God and his people that to this day brings new souls into the churches. People who seek truth and cannot find it elsewhere in an age of secularist materialism and sexual consumerism. And with every year, we must have confidence in this too. More empirical evidence of the kind mentioned earlier accumulates to suggest who's on the right side of that ledger about materialism and truth. So, in closing, to discern the record of the last half century is to see that traditional Christianity has been right to stand as a sign of contradiction to the devastation that now surrounds us, just as it was right to stand as a sign of contradiction to the devastation and chaos of ancient Rome. We can also see that capitulating wholesale to the sexual revolution has been an epic fail for the churches that have tried it. And finally, we can see, and this is my point in Primal Screams, that the way we are living today is causing suffering among a great many people in our time, including people who can't name the origin of that suffering themselves. The anguish behind identity politics is one expression. Believers are called to ameliorate the sorrows and burdens of our fellows on the earth. And if we keep that call in mind above all, I really think we can get to a place of healing where the more wounded among us can find new strength thanks to the less wounded, and a genuine journey towards civil and other reconciliation can begin. Thank you very much. Happy to have a conversation and questions. Thank you.